Hello, my name is 환산스님, and this is Sun Meditation in English. Now, before we enter into guided meditation today, I would like to mention that some experienced Zen meditation practitioners have contacted me and have noted that the way we conduct meditation on this program is quite different than what they learned, although both forms of meditation, all of this meditation seems to go under the heading of Zen or Sun. So this is something that I would like to talk about today and resolve some misunderstandings that I believe exist in the world. So everyone please assume meditation posture, and we will begin as usual with preparation breathing. So breathe in through the nose, completely fill your chest, hold, and then exhale through the mouth, okay? Inhale, hold, exhale. Once again, inhale, hold, and then exhale. And now we'll enter into abdominal breathing. And we do abdominal breathing only with our nose. To briefly review, we inhale through our nose a little bit longer, a little bit more slowly and more gently than usual. As we inhale, we push out our lower belly until it feels comfortably full. Then we hold for 2 to 3 seconds. And then we exhale through our nose again and draw in our lower belly as if we're pushing the air out of it. Okay, and the exhalation will be slightly longer than the inhalation. So 2 to 3 seconds to inhale, 2 to 3 seconds to pause, and then 3 to 4 seconds on the out breath. So why don't we try that together? Inhale, hold, exhale. Inhale, hold, and then exhale. And now let's add our hwadu, the question that is the object of our meditation, to this practice. So we inhale, hold, and then together out loud, imoko. Once more, inhale, hold, and then together, imoko. Imoko. That's in English, Y-I-M-W-O-T-G-O, and that means, what is this? What is this that directs my body? When I think, what is this within me? The source of my consciousness that generates my thoughts. When I feel an emotion, what is it within me that is feeling that emotion? When I'm sad, what suffers that sadness? When I'm happy, what enjoys that happiness? This is a question we're going to ask ourselves. This is the question we always ask ourselves in our meditation. And through this question, we create the inner state of doubt, the state of being blocked, the state of trying to know the unknowable and to see what cannot be perceived. In the original Korean, it's called the unknowable doubt. We are going to create a state of being unable to know. So once again, inhale, hold, and then exhale. And once again, I will ask all of our studio audience members and our viewers at home to continue holding this posture and doing this abdominal breathing and meditating on the imoko hwadu throughout the course of this program. And here now, I would like you to pay close attention, because I would like to now address the questions that I alluded to at the beginning of this program that some more experienced Zen meditators from around the world have brought up with me. What they tell me is that the way they learned Zen meditation, this form of Zen meditation, is that they use the hwadu, the question, just as we do, but what they do is they solve one, they generate a response or a reply to it or have some kind of personal breakthrough, and then they are assigned another one. And then they work on that one, and then they're assigned another one, and in a sort of serial fashion, kind of like going up a spiritual staircase, they move from one hwadu to the next, one level to the next. Now, I've mentioned on this program before that there are in the classical Chinese Chan, Korean Sun, and Japanese Zen Buddhist canon, there are recorded 1,700 official hwadus that can be used in this practice. So imoko is not the only question that we might use in this form of meditation. Now, these hwadus are also called in Korean kongan. Now, kongan in Chinese is pronounced kungan, and in Japanese it's pronounced koan. So especially Western viewers and international viewers may be more familiar with the term koan. And that word is basically used synonymously with hwadu, but kongan or kungan or koan means a public matter, an issue pertaining to the nature of our existence that needs to be resolved. Now, within the way that these hwadus were produced, according to the tradition, they were produced in the natural exchange of questions and answers between masters and disciples and between enlightened masters among themselves. And within that context, the I Wo Go Hwadu, the what is this hwadu, is considered to be the very first one. It's also considered to be the easiest one to understand. A long time ago in ancient China, a great enlightened master named Hui Neng, Grandmaster Hui Neng, stood in front of the great assembly, the congregation of monastic and lay meditative practitioners. And he said to them, "There is a thing here that acts as a pillar for the sky and holds up the earth. It cannot be named, and its form cannot be drawn. It is brighter than the sun and blacker than slate. It is in the center of all things, but if you look for it there, it cannot be found. What is this?" So he threw this question out to the assembly, and they adopted it as their object of meditation. At that time, the word hwadu or kongan didn't even exist yet, hadn't even been invented, but this is considered to be the first use of the hwadu, of a question in East Asian Buddhist meditation. Now, since then, many of these questions have been generated, and then these questions are used in meditation, and sometimes masters give answers to these questions, enlightened answers, and then those answers in turn are used as objects of meditation. Now, probably the most famous kongan or koan within this tradition is the famous mu kongan or koan. And there's a story that's attached to this. One of the greatest, if not the greatest, Chinese Chan master in history, his name was Chao Zhou. And the story goes that he was walking along with his disciple, and he was teaching his disciple the most basic and foundational Mahayana Buddhist teaching that all sentient beings, all living beings possess the Buddha nature, possess an essential enlightened nature, possess the ability to become enlightened. And as he was teaching this to the disciple, a dog suddenly crossed their path as they walked along in probably what was their monastic compound. And so the disciple pointed to the dog and said, "Does that dog also have Buddha nature?" Whereupon Chao Zhou suddenly turned around and said to him, "Mu." Now, mu, which is pronounced wu, W-U in Chinese, means no, or there is not. So the disciple was naturally thrown into a state of unknowable doubt, because the Buddha himself had taught that all sentient beings actually do have Buddha nature. And here was Chao Zhou, the greatest master of his age, direct descendant of the Buddha, representative of the Buddha, and considered a living Buddha in his own right, suddenly saying no. So in the disciple's mind, which is it, yes or no? Now, this is a very, very famous kongan, and there is a tendency, I believe, based on what I've heard, among international practitioners. To the way that they perform the mu hwadu is they do the sitting and the breathing just as we do on the show, but on the out breath, as I understand it, there's a habit of saying just mu. So you breathe in, hold, and on the out breath, mu. Then breathe in, hold, and then mu. Now, from the point of traditional Korean Sun Buddhist teaching, this way of meditating does not produce the state of doubt. So strictly speaking, this is considered an inaccurate or misinformed way of practicing. That is not to say that it's completely wrong. There are actually 3 approaches to the mu kongan or hwadu that are explained, and one of them is primary and the other 2 is secondary. The first way of doing this form of hwadu meditation, the mu hwadu, is called, I'll call it in English, single raising. In Korean, it's called danje. You breathe in, you hold, and then you go mu. Now, this is considered a preliminary way of approaching the hwadu to be used by beginners, because beginning meditators usually are distracted by random thoughts and find it hard to focus their attention. So by saying mu, mu, you calm your mind and clarify it and center it and build the concentrative power that you need to move to a higher level of meditation. Now, the drawback of this way of meditating, the reason why we don't stay just with this one way of meditating upon this hwadu is because it is so calming that if you just stay with it, there's a danger of becoming drowsy or clouded at the very end. So once you've attained a certain level of inner stability and clarity and calmness, then you move to the primary method, which in the tradition is called complete raising, or in Korean, jeonje. And in this, you don't just say mu, mu. What you do is you inhale, hold, and on the out breath you say, why did Chaojo say mu? Why? When you ask why, a sense of urgency, the unknowable doubt is created. So in Korea, in Korean Sun Buddhism, that's the way it's always been performed. Why did Chaojo say mu? Now, as I mentioned, there's a third method, which is also secondary. And this third method is called active raising, in Korean, kunje. And this form is used when, in the course of meditative practice, we may get sort of bogged down and we may feel that each time we think of our hwadu, there doesn't seem to be any resonance. So active raising is used as a kind of a cure or a solution for that. And what you do in active raising is simply you raise the hwadu in quicker succession than you're used to. So you breathe in, hold, why did Chaojo say mu? Why did Chaojo say mu? Why did Chaojo say mu? Until finally you can embed it back into your consciousness, and once you feel focused on it, then again you return to the primary way, the complete raising, where, with this long, slow breaths and the deep mind, you say, why did Chaojo say mu? So this is considered the traditional and proper way of approaching the so-called mu hwadu. And I share it with you on this program today because for those meditators who are continuing on with this particular hwadu, just as a reference point, you should know that this is how it has been done traditionally. Okay. Now, the other thing to address here is that in traditional Sun Buddhism, as it's performed in Korea, we stay with one hwadu. And there is no serial advancement from one koan to the next, one hwadu to the next, like going up a staircase. Within the Sun Buddhist tradition, all of the kongans point to the same enlightenment. If you get enlightened to one, you get enlightened to the truth that all 1,700 kongans point to. Now, enlightened masters will use the kongans with each other to test each other's development, but we as unenlightened beginning practitioners need to stay with just one and create a state of doubt. Our teacher Sun Master Songdam is extremely adamant on this point and can be quite critical of the method of moving from one hwadu to the next. There are traditions in which if you resolve a certain number of hwadus, you're given a certain kind of spiritual title like Dharma Master or something, and then if you solve another certain number of them, then you get a higher title and so forth. And then if you solve all 1,700 of them, then maybe you're treated as a total master. But what we need to understand is that this isn't a game. These are not puzzles. The topic always, the focus within Sun Buddhist practice and teaching is always what has been called the one great task of birth and death. The goal is to transcend our personal suffering, transcend all the pain of this process of dying and being born again, dying and being born again, in the classical religious sense of going from one lifetime to another, one body to another, and then also in real time from one moment to the next, 1 minute to the next, 1 day to the next. We are trying to transcend that suffering and become enlightened to what the true nature of our existence and the nature of the world around us. This is a real concrete problem that we're trying to address, and the answers to the koans have no meaning if there is no enlightenment to support them. The idea is not to generate answers. The idea is to break through the darkness of our ignorance into the light of spiritual awakening. So this is something that needs to be properly understood. This is the teaching as it is presented within traditional Sun Buddhism and Chan Buddhism in China, and to treat these koans as some kind of puzzles and to throw them at one another, when you haven't had an authentic enlightenment experience, is considered within the tradition wrong-headed at best and silly and even harmful at worst. So this is something that I would like all of our viewers to very seriously consider, that if we're going to bother to invest the time and the effort and take the trouble to meditate, we ought to do it right, and we ought to do it with the utmost level of honesty and sincerity that we can bring to it, considering that we are actually investing our lives into it. So this is what I would like to say to the matter that has been raised recently by other Zen Buddhist practitioners, and I offer these teachings as a reference. Now, the topic for today's meditation and contemplation is the value and role that silence may play within our time, within modern society. It's quite well known now that we live in an age of an unprecedented level of communication and dialogue with one another. In any economically developed nation, on average, people have really just an amazing selection of methods for getting in touch with each other, communicating with each other. I mean, just off the top of my head, we have cell phones, we have email, the internet. On the internet, there's Twitter and Facebook and Skype, and these media and these programs are only proliferating as time goes by. And I think that on the whole, this is a good thing and a necessary thing, because as our communications and transportation technology continues to develop, the various nations and cultures and traditions and religions of the world are coming into ever closer proximity with one another. So we need dialogue to understand one another, to avoid misunderstanding and to avoid conflict or resolve conflicts that may have been formed. So the more ways to communicate with one another, I think the better on the whole. But that said, with so much talking going on, we may find that we are sort of becoming overly stimulated, becoming overly mentally busy. And we may feel that the communication, the dialogue is starting to turn just into chatter or noise. And that while there's a lot of people talking, very little seems to be being said. And if this kind of feeling or experience or trend continues, we have this very strange paradoxical situation where people in the midst of all that interconnectedness feel somehow alone, cut off from one another and alienated. Because communication has become so easy, because we do it so often on the move while being distracted by other things, we may be throwing words and texts and images and sounds at each other, but there's very little human presence behind that. And so we don't feel like we're getting full human contact anymore. So it is in this context, I think, that we could remind ourselves of the value of silence, especially because silence is so venerated in all of the religious traditions across the world. Especially in Sun Buddhism, according to its self-understanding, Sun Buddhism is considered to have been created, to have been invented and founded within the context of silence. There's a very famous story regarding that I would like to share with you. Now, it's said that one day the Buddha stood on a mountain called Vulture Peak in India, and a multitude of living beings gathered to hear his enlightened words, his Dharma speech. So as he stood before them, within the throng, there were said to be deities and spirits of the dead, and even animals. All sorts of beings that the modern view tends not to acknowledge these days, but this is how the story goes. And it's said that when the Buddha speaks, everyone hears what they need to hear. This is called, within Buddhist language, the original sound or the original voice. Each person hears what they need to advance them on their path to enlightenment. So as he stood before them, and the crowd gathered and waited for him to speak, the Indian god Brahma, the emperor of the first realm of Dhyana, descended from the heavens and knelt before the Buddha and offered up a single beautiful lotus flower. And the Buddha received the flower from the god, and then inexplicably he held it in front of the crowd and just stood there. And the crowd waited in anticipation for something to happen, but nothing happened. The Buddha was just standing there holding the flower. No one knew what was going on. And then the Buddha's eldest disciple, Mahakashyapa, who was sitting in the back, looked at the flower and smiled. The Buddha saw him smile, and the Buddha addressed the crowd and said, "I possess the treasury of the true Dharma I, the wondrous mind of nirvana, the true form of formlessness, the subtle Dharma gate that does not establish words or letters and is a special transmission beyond the doctrines. This I entrust to Mahakashyapa." Now, this event is called among Western Buddhists the flower sermon, and it is considered the first precedent of the event of what's called mind-to-mind transmission in Sun Buddhism. And the idea, as seen in the Buddha's speech to the crowd, is that truth, ultimate enlightened truth, cannot be conveyed in words or letters and cannot be contained in doctrine. They must be communicated, transmitted directly from enlightened mind to enlightened mind. And that is what's happened. The Buddha holds up the flower, Mahakashyapa smiles in response. So Sun Buddhism was founded in silence and considers the most profound truths, the most important matters in life to be inexpressible in language or ideas. They must simply be shared mind to mind in silence. This is the idea that I would like to consider for today, and we can think about how to apply it within our own ordinary lives. But for now, why don't we take a break, and after the break, we'll continue on with this discussion. And we're back again. Now, in the first half, we briefly reviewed the famous flower sermon in which the Buddha held up a single lotus flower in front of a crowd of followers, and only his main disciple, his eldest disciple, Mahakashyapa, directly perceived the meaning of the Buddha's raising of the lotus flower and smiled in return. And this was the first instance of so-called mind-to-mind transmission of the Buddhist Dharma from master to disciple. Now, often when this story is told, people ask, well, is this historically true? Did something like this really happen? And then there are supernatural elements in the story. Heavenly deities and spiritual beings are said to have attended and participated in this assembly. So the story seems removed from the reality that we tend to acknowledge these days. And there's very little documentation to support the claim that something like that actually historically happened. But I think that when you ask about the historicity of this event, whether it's actually historically happened or not, I think that you're missing the point of the story. That regardless of whether, certain people named those names, got together in that place and did exactly those things is not the most important factor here, so much as is the nature of the master-disciple bond that is being drawn here. If you look at it in that way, it is absolutely a true story. Anyone who has ever practiced under an enlightened master will know that this is a true story. This is what happens between masters and disciples. Just within my own limited personal experience as a disciple and then later a personal attendant, the personal attendant for my teacher, Sun Master Songdam, what I can say about that is that the bulk of teaching that he has given to us, his disciples, was undeniably given in silence. The fact is that the things he actually says in his Dharma speeches, to be completely frank, I had already read before I ever met him in my personal studies, and that is the case for many of the disciples who come to him. It is within his silent presence that his greatest teachings are given. It is within the ordinary flow of events, his ordinary life and behavior, having a meal together, or even something as simple as pulling a tissue out of a tissue box, or just a way of sitting. These are the most eloquent, are the most Dharma transmitting activities that we will find in the presence of a true master. So this is a very accurate historical description, and while we may not know exactly what the Buddha looked like, or whether his eldest disciple was really named Mahakashyapa, and whether people really gathered at Vulture Peak or not, we may question those kind of things, but without doubt, we do not have to question that in that bond, that is what happened, not only between the Buddha and Mahakashyapa, but throughout history, between enlightened masters and their disciples wherever they were, whether it was India or China or Korea or Japan, or now out in the broader world of all the continents. It is not only a description of the past, of what happened in the past between enlightened masters and disciples, it is a description of what happens now between true enlightened masters and their disciples, and it is a description of what will always happen. It is a paradigm. It is a description of the fundamental structure of the master-disciple relationship and the manner in which true spiritual teachings are passed. And this for us, maybe we don't live with an enlightened master. Maybe we're not specifically in tutelage with a master, but nonetheless, this is something that I believe we can bring into our own lives. In the case of Sun Master Songdam, he is very famous for having conducted a vow of silence that lasted for 10 years. And of all the people that I have ever met, I have never known anyone who understood silence and could use it as communication in quite the way that he could. He is a master of silence. Some people say that people who live in very snowy regions can detect, can perceive, a great many variety of shades of white in the snow, in the snowy landscape around them. In the same way, there are a great variety of forms of silence. And silence from one occasion to the next can be very different. The texture of it, the tone of it, and just the way it is between people can change from time to time. And meditation masters know how to communicate through silence, through their pure presence. And this is something that we can learn through our meditative practice. The reason why this is important for us in this age of dialogue, of text messaging and video conferencing and all these other technological wonders that we are now beginning to take for granted, is that from the Buddhist perspective, words have no meaning if we don't understand silence. Structures have no meaning if we don't understand emptiness. The two always go together. And we can see this on a common sense level. In music, it's the alternation between sound and silence that creates music, that creates a language of thought and feeling. If you just have one persistent note, one uninterrupted sound, you're not going to hear music. There will be no transmission of a person's heart and soul and thought. Likewise, in architecture, it's the juxtaposition of empty space and solid structure that can create a living world out of seemingly non-living things like concrete and wood and stone and steel and so forth. Without emptiness, without empty space, there is no architecture. In the visual arts, it's the interplay between light and shadow that creates a vision of reality. With no shadow, if you just have a blast of light, no art, no vision of the world. And within the Asian tradition, specifically within Taoism, they go in describing the value of silence and the value of empty space and emptiness in general, they will go one step further. They will say that a cup, a vessel, is functional, is a cup because it's empty inside. If it were a solid block, a solid cylinder, we wouldn't be able to fill it with water or food or whatever. It is the emptiness that allows it to be a cup, that gives it its functionality and identity as an instrument in our lives. Likewise, a wheel must have a hole in the center at the hub for the axle to go through. Otherwise, it's just a disc and completely useless for transportation. The hole in the middle of the wheel is what makes it the wheel. And perhaps most profoundly, a house is only a house if it is almost completely empty inside. And as I've mentioned on this program, unquestionably dialogue, open, honest dialogue is unquestionably absolutely essential to creating healthy, productive human relationships. But they have no meaning if there isn't a shared silence at the heart of them. Maybe the words and the ways in which we communicate with each other create a framework of understanding. It's the terms that we negotiate with one another in terms of how we'll address each other and how we'll relate to each other. But it's the silence, the shared silence of commonly held truths that gives that relationship its substance and its content. Without silence, it's nothing. It's just words and text. And that's exactly what we feel when we are inundated by so-called information. When there is no silence behind them, when there is no human presence, no attention behind them, no sincerity behind them, it just becomes noise, and we find this quite oppressive. So this is something that I would very much like to recommend to our viewers and the members of our studio audience, that through meditation we can learn the art of silence and bring that back into our lives, and it will generate more meaning for us than the most eloquent text and doctrine and books that we can find. Silence will contain far more for us than that. And in that, when we understand that nature of silence, we begin to see that meditation is not something that you just do in isolation. It has social application as well. It can be shared. In fact, according to Sun tradition, it must be shared to create a truly authentic human relationship. The examples of mind-to-mind transmission that I've alluded to at the beginning of this program. So, then how would we do that? And this is something that I would like to recommend on a very concrete and practical level, is that if you happen to be meditating and you have a meditation partner, one thing you can do after meditation is just share a cup of green tea. Green tea is sort of the beverage of choice for meditators, but you can share a cup of green tea together in silence, in shared silence with one another. Now, I'll caution you, that sounds very kind of elegant and poetic and romantic, but when you actually do it, it can be a little bit awkward, because suddenly you're sitting in front of each other not saying a word. And that awkwardness is part of the teaching. What that tells you is that you're not used to each other's unadorned presence. You're used to only seeing what you want to see by relating to each other according to habitual ways of addressing one another. you're not open to each other's total presence, the totality of that person. And when confronted with that, either you'll feel awkward or you'll feel like you're in front of a stranger, even though you may have known that person for years. And so when you feel that awkwardness, when you feel like, let's start talking again, what you've really learned is that more often than not, dialogue, especially insincere dialogue or dialogue without our full presence, serves to keep people apart, not to bring them together. Because we may not be used to, full-on human presence. We're unadorned by words and gestures and other media between us, standing between us. If it's just the two of you and a cup of tea, things can get very, very intense very quickly. But if you deal with that discomfort and work with it, what you may find is that in that silence, you can rediscover one another, renew and rejuvenate an old relationship, maybe even find conflict resolution there that no amount of fair speaking and understanding through words can give. So this is a kind of experiment that I would like to recommend to all of you, especially with people that you're close with, that see what it's like to share silence, to meditate in one another's presence. Now, strictly speaking, I would like to point out that silence is not merely the absence of air vibrations. It's not merely the absence of auditory signals in our brain. Silence, strictly speaking, within the classical Buddhist context, really refers to our inward state of having a clear, calm, untroubled mind. No constantly distracting thoughts, no disfocus across all these changing images in our mind. Just a clear mind that's completely present and empty. When you can understand that, then you will see that you can find silence anywhere, on a subway, in the middle of an argument, on the streets in the sound of traffic, in a meeting where everyone's talking at a party, even in a nightclub where they're playing music. You can find silence because the silence actually lives within ourselves. And this is something that I would very much like to recommend. This is something that we learn naturally in the course of doing Imoko. We don't have to direct our Imoko practice toward finding silence. It was simply the silence, that kind of rich, resonant silence will naturally emerge in the course of our practice, and we'll take to it like a fish to water because that is our basic nature. Now, I think this is very important because, just to name an example, in our food culture, I believe there is a tendency for modern people there's a certain regression that's occurring where people start to look for stimulus rather than actual flavor. People are busy, people are distracted, they want something that pierces their consciousness and gives them a real unmistakable signal to sort of distract them from whatever is troubling them. And that's something very different than a flavor, which is layered and contains many dimensions and has to be really savored, given your full attention and given time to really plumb the depths of a true flavor, of a well-prepared meal. But in modern fast food culture, it's either sweet, salty, or greasy, or spicy, because they're and that's just stimulus. There's no content there. There's no emotional content. There's no path that's taken in an experience like that. Unfortunately, I think that this fast food mentality is bleeding into the way that we deal with one another precisely because of the proliferation of this instant messaging, instant communication, as opposed to real dialogue or real shared silence. And this is something that we're losing the art of, that emotions are not simple. Emotions, like well-prepared food, are complex. We're never just happy or just sad or just afraid or just angry. Usually, we're feeling all of those things at once. And in meditation, we can begin to perceive the complexity of all the things that we feel in our heart, the richness, the depth, the variety, the curiousness of it and the wonder of it all within our hearts. And when we can do that, then we can detect another person's true presence, because they are reflected in our hearts, and we will feel them in our hearts if our hearts are quiet and empty and still enough to receive them. In that way, the essence of human relationships becomes a process of emptying ourselves through meditation, and that is from the Asian spiritual traditional point of view the proper way for us to address one another, through that openness and emptiness. So this again is something that meditation gives to us automatically, and this is something that I very much want to recommend to all of our viewers and all of our studio audience members. Meditation, by bringing silence and quiet and emptiness into our minds, opens us up to the experience of life itself. And the experience of life itself, direct contact with and perception of reality, teaches us in a way that no book or even teacher can. And it delivers to us an amount of information and a complex integration of information that no amount of book learning or computer usage can ever hope to match. It's like instant downloading of huge amounts of knowledge about the universe and about human existence. This is the promise that meditation offers to all of us. So in closing, I would like to offer or recommend a little bit of homework, and that is that at a certain time, maybe once a month or even once a week, to unplug ourselves, to go into silence, literally into silence, meaning don't talk for a day, don't receive phone calls for a day, don't look at the computer for a day, don't read anything. Just be quiet and live quietly and rediscover the art of solitude. Once upon a time in both Western and Eastern cultures, not talking a lot was considered more respectable, more beautiful, more honorable, to be reticent, to be, to reserve your words. Now, this may not be quite that possible anymore in this multicultural, multi-everything world that we now live in. But that doesn't mean we have to completely abandon solitude and silence. So this is something that we can do for ourselves, to cleanse ourselves, to rejuvenate ourselves, and to engage our lives again in a vital and profitable way. So once again, thank you to all of you for attending, and thank you to our viewers at home. And I think our time is up, so I will close once again with the traditional Buddhist greeting. May we all attain the Buddha.